They said the structure wouldn't follow any engineering standards, but what it endured, no ordinary design could withstand. Decades later, when men in clean shirts and careful notebooks called such houses improbable, the winter at Pine Hollow would be the argument they could not deny, not by numbers, but by the simple fact that people came through with their children, their animals, and enough food to last until spring. Silas Carter woke to a sun that meant nothing of warmth. It rose pale and thin behind a ribbon of pines, and his breath fogged white in the doorframe before he had crossed the threshold. Outside, the roofs of Amos Reed's arched houses lay under a skin of frost, soft as if a blanket had been spread and then powdered by the wind. Thin columns of smoke rose from their chimneys and caught, for a moment, in the low light. The village of Pine Hollow sat like a clutch of buried hills at the edge of the timber, each mound a promise and an experiment. Timber ribs bent into an arch, laced and covered, then capped with earth to hide the house and hold the heat. Silas dressed with slow, deliberate motions. Eliza had set the kettle over the bench the night before. Coals still glowed under the stone, and the smell of long-kept warmth met him like a hand on the shoulder. The bench, Amos's idea, ran along the back wall, an overbuilt hearth of stone with a narrow passage for smoke cut through its belly. By day it gave off a slow, steady heat. By night it softened the sting of frost that came with the pine's breath. The children slept in a knot of blankets on the floor near the bench. Clara's hair made a dark halo. Tom and Jacob breathed in and out, a small chorus of warmth. On mornings like this, every household ritual felt like a tie to the rest of the settlement. A lad hauls water, a woman trims the lamp, a neighbor fetches a bale of hay for the mare. Practical things stitched the community together. Amos had come to Pine Hollow 3 winters before, not a man of much talk, but with hands that spoke a language of wood and rope. He'd seen arches where others saw only a curious curve, bread ovens, peat houses on maps from his youth. Old-world notes he liked to remind folks were older than their doubts. He said the shape carried weight to the sides, like an egg. "You shell an egg," he told a smirking group one market day, "and you will find it will take a beating better than one flat on its face." People laughed then. They set stakes, they drew lines in the earth to measure how high and how wide, and they asked how such houses would stand when the snow came heavy and cold. Silas could picture Amos, shoulders bent to the task, the house as if he were tightening the spine of something living. The method looked simple but required work in an unforgiving order. First they dug a pit, no wider than a small living room, deep enough to let the rib ends sit below the frost line. The base of that pit held the first secret, a ledger of stones set in a shallow bed of clay, level and steady. Then the ribs, oak, ash, whatever sturdy timber the winter allowed, steamed and bent, notched at the ends to sit into the ledger. Where steaming in midwinter was a kindness seldom offered by the season, they made clever allowances, warmth in the forge and wet leather wraps, or in particularly brutal days, they used green ribs and pinned them in place, binding with rawhide that would dry and pull the timbers tight. He remembered watching the first of the arches go up like a slow breath. 2 men with a rope under a rib, lifting on cue. Notches sliding into the ledger like keys finding their locks. Amos perched on top, his draw-knife flashing in quick, confident strokes, shaving a little at an edge, checking the curve with an eye that had learned wood's mood. They lashed the ribs together across the crown with smaller wood, crossbeams that tied them into a single skin. Then came the mats, layers of grass and reed, dried and woven, laid thick as rugs across the ribs to form a kind of inner skin. On top of that, they piled earth. Not a careless shove of dirt, but a careful tamping in layers, packing it until the mound felt as much a roof as it was ground reclaimed. You could hear it when Amos finished one, silence then a slow murmur of approval. The arch was not just an architecture, it was a confidence. The innards of the house were snug, low ceiling, yes, but the curve made the small space feel larger, the inner walls bending toward you like the inside of a bowl. The bench lay along the back wall, stones fitted together like riverbeds. A narrow flue caught the smoke at the hearth and sent it under the stones before letting it out the chimney. Smoke moving through stone is a patient thing. The stones took the heat and kept it, letting the bench sit warm through the gray hours when the wood was banked down to a few embers. Children could sit on the bench and warm their legs against rock that remembered the day's coal. There was enough practical magic in the design to make sensible folk nod. They burned less wood and prized it accordingly. Winters were thinner on their stores after the benches were in use. You could stand in an arched house and press your hand against the stone and feel the memory of last night's fire. The wooden ribs shed snow in ways a flat roof could not. Snow wrapped the arch like a second blanket, adding to the insulation rather than pressing against a horizontal plane. The earth cap kept winds from hunting at the seams. Amos had a quiet pride, but he never promised miracles, only that human need and the right shape might work together. Silas had been skeptical at first. He had a flat-roofed house he'd built with his father, the beams square and familiar. It had its own virtues: tall doorways, space for hanging meat, a loft for grain. But the winters had taught him that every choice asked a cost. When Amos offered to build a new house on the low field above Silas's patch, he agreed half out of curiosity and half because his youngest seemed to like the idea of a house that looked like a hill. The process of building it taught him more than any argument ever could. You learned where to set your foot, how to steady an angled beam with a friend's shoulder, how to hack a notch deep enough without splitting the rib, and how to cinch rawhide so tight it sang as it dried. On the day Silas's house went up, the whole settlement worked as if someone had set a rhythm. Mercy and Abigail steamed reed mats by the riverbank, their hands nimble with the twine. Hiram and Eli dug for ledger stones until their backs bowing deep. Children ran errands and handed nails, their breath boiling in the air. Even Buck, Silas's mare, seemed to sense the day's labor and waited placidly, ears twitching at the clink of tools. By dusk the ribs rose, a half-circle cut into the sky. By night, where there had been a bare pit, a new mound lay sleeping. Silas liked to show neighbors how the arch carried its weight. He would take a hand against the inner curve and say, "Think of an egg. If you press its sides, the top and bottom carry the force away. The arch does the same, pushes the load out and down. No flat plane to bend, no long beam holding everything like a plank. The ribs take it and move it to the ground." Käsigt. It was a small explanation, plain and practical, but it satisfied more than just the mind. It settled a restlessness. Folks could see it in the way snow fell off the curve instead of clinging and looting the timbers with weight. That first winter with the bench, Silas noticed how quickly a home could become a pocket of calm. The bench kept its glow after supper, and the children sat with their mittens off, claws warming to the stone. He watched Eliza bake bread in the little oven they set within the ark's heart. She would press the dough on a board and slide it to the back where the stones stored the day's smoke, then pull out loaves that smelled of hearthlight. There was a small dignity in those routines, a woman tending dough as wind rattled the outer thatch, a family mending a harness by the window, a man whittling a spoon while the light shut itself down to a narrow silver. News of Amos's houses moved by slow shouts and by longer routes. Travelers passing through stopped and asked, sometimes skeptically, how such a mound could be called a house. They would lean against a rib and admit how the cold seemed to stop at its skin. Still, at market, in the polite circles that liked to measure things, doubts stuck. Some called the idea untested for the really hard weather, the long stretches of white that could come from the north. Others worried about water finding its way through earth, about rot at the ribs' shoulders buried beneath soil. Amos answered with the kind of words that belong to craft, "Keep the ribs off the earth with a good ledger, pack your earthlight in layers, and let us make the knots tight." Not certainty, it was never certainty, but it was enough for men who had to begin again each spring. The first hints of the storm were small. A hawk, usually high and easy, dipped low and rode along the tree line like a worried thought. Horses jostled in stalls with ears pricked. Buck pawed at his bedding and stamped a little mantle of steam. Mercy came by the Carter house and pressed her finger to the window pane to test the glass's hardness, an old habit for reading weather. The wind that day had a bite that was different, a dry keen that pulled at seams and made the lamp flame lean. Eliza did not like sudden weather. She was a careful woman, and her voice tight when she called the children in early. There were things she stocked in tin and barrel, and the larder that winter was honest but not extravagant. When Mercy stopped by and said that the men at the trading post had watched a squall funnel off the plains, Amos sharpened his adze and counted the ribs in his head. Hiram, the sort who read the wind as others read scripture, tapped at the ledger stones in his mind and said little. People began to move in a particular way. Slower steps, hurried checks. Woodpiles were made tidy and then doubled over in haste. Jars were moved into the warmest corners. There is a hum in a village when it senses a trial. It is not panic, but a gathered breath. The storm arrived with a procession of small disasters. It started as a shuddering north wind that turned the air granular, then fell into a sustained white that swallowed lanes. Snow built on the pines and then began creeping toward houses like a second, living mist. What came first and most insidious for the settlement was the ice. Springs that had run year-round began to give the wrong signs. Slowness in the trickle, a glassy shell caught in the runnel, then stillness. The Carter well knit itself closed with a neat skin of crystal overnight. Where a stream had always offered water, a barrier now kept the settlement dependent on stored measures. An ice dam formed on the low creek that fed the village's main spring. As the water pooled behind the freezing lip, it found new paths. It lifted. In the quiet way water finds a push, and then a new place, and began to trickle around stones. Where it slipped under root, it froze into a lip that reached and reached until the whole run of water hissed in a slow, searching voice. When the dam finally broke in a heavy heave beneath the tempest's weight, a sheet of ice tore free and took with it a shallow berm the men had built to channel the flow. That act, simple and almost accidental, robbed Pine Hollow of a steady draw of water for those first 2 days while the men dug with their hands at the source and broke the ice into pieces they could haul home and thaw before cooking. Worse than the ice was the snow's appetite. It piled against doors and flung slush into corners where a flue might breathe. The arched roofs fared better in some respects. Their curves shed much of the accumulating weight, and the earth cap acted as a blanket. But not all of them had been finished under ideal conditions. The outer edge of Oak Ridge's new house, built with haste before the cold truly bit, had a thin strip where earth lay lighter. Under the first heavy night, a rib at that edge kissed frost and then bowed. Snow finds its compromises with a roof seam and is clever at discovering the places a builder let haste rule. By the time dawn came and the creek laid down silent, the outer edge had settled, and a small collapse took a corner beam, and with it a handful of thatch and earth. It looked like a small wound, not fatal, but visible. Silas saw the sag with a sharpness in his chest. He was no fool of weather. He had read seasons enough to know that such a wound, left, could grow. He set Eliza with the children. Mercy and Abigail came with pots and blankets. Amos arrived with his kit and a pair of rope and a calm that sank into the air like a planted post. They worked from inside, lashing a straight timber along the span to take some of the new load, slipping wedges, clamping with the kind of temporary supports men could make in haste. They used rawhide for binders that night, wet hide looped and tied so that as it dried it would draw the timbers tight, the shrinkage its own kind of hand. It was practical, not elegant, but necessary. The bench saved a life in those hours. Once the men had the new brace up, they dragged coals forward and fed the bench a measured warmth. The stones responded, and from its stored heat the bench gave them a refuge from the wind. Hands grew less numb. When a man's fingers find purchase on something warm, his choices widen. They used warmed stones and clay to make a patch. Clay, when carried through an open yard, could freeze if left to the air, so they warmed buckets in the sun's meager face and passed them hand to hand like a chain of favor. The patching was slow and careful work, tamping damp clay into seams, waiting for the rawhide to pull tight, reaching for a shovel to remove snow that tried to bury the effort as it came down. There was improvisation. Pitch saved a seam here, a strap of leather pulled tight there, a short shoring post driven near the ledger to take a load. They found that the arch's shape gave them time. Because snow shed, and because the ribs took weight to their shoulders, the house did not snap. Instead it bowed and flexed in ways they could respond to. The arch dealt with force slowly rather than a sudden failure. Amos kept repeating that image of an egg, slow and steady, and the men nodded with faces lined by wind. The supply issue grew as the large white wall moved closer. Wood that had been stored against the lean-to became banked under drifts 3 feet deep. A pallet of split stock, a day's worth for a family, would be found sealed as if the snow had taken interest in rationing. Mercy and Abigail sat and counted, made a plan to chop rations into smaller fires. There is a kind of economy that you learn only when a season seems willing to test you. Your woodpile becomes not a measure of wealth, but of future heat. Eliza wrapped the choicest jars in wool and tucked them into the bench's warm skin. They would cook carefully, stews made to feed twice, soups stretched with barley. Children grew used to thin porridge mornings and made games from the drifts that cut off their play. They were small and thus able to find joy in the simple rituals, even as the world stiffened with white. Hiram and Eli became the obvious pair to ride for supplies to Morgan's Fork. The trading post there was rough and often as patient as a mountain, but it had trade goods and an account with Morgan himself. Packing a sled into the storm was an act of quiet courage. 2 men, 2 horses, a modest expectation of return. They sealed saddles, wrapped necks, tucked blankets, and took to the road while the sky was still a low pewter, before the white fell hard. Buck nosed at the cart as if to say he would go too if he could. Men left with faces set, and the settlement watched them go until the riders were swallowed by the blow. The road to Morgan's Fork was a throat that cut between pines. It was narrow and had gullies where wind ate paths clean, then filled them in a mile on. Hiram rode with the reins tight in his palms. Snow drove sideways and found the rider's cheeks like small knives. Once a drift rose up like a tide, and the leader lost the way. How quickly a horse will be a stranger to his footing when the land masks its shape. Eli shouted, a raw sound, and they turned slow circles until the harnessed beasts found a familiar scent and a memory of trail. At one point, Eli's horse slipped on black ice, hidden beneath a shallow cross of snow. The animal lay with a groan, and then thrust itself up again at Eli's urging. Its breathing was loud in the tight air. The men worked to brace the sled and to keep the load dry and wrapped. Every mile offered a small peril: thin ice over a creek, a snag of curl that would catch a runner, the possibility of a complete whiteout where the world dissolved into a single color. Back in the hollow, the men who remained did not idle. They dug at the spring with pick and shovel, breaking the ice pack into chunks and hauling the frozen water home to melt by the bench. When snow banked against a door, they shoveled from the inside to avoid freezing the lock's brass solid. Children were instructed in small, manageable tasks: to sweep snow from the hearth before lighting, to mind the lamp's oil. Even Bran, the dog, seemed to understand urgency, prowling the perimeter and barking when a gust moved oddly along a fence. That animal sense of alarm sharpened everyone's waking. At night the storm's voice changed. It was no longer merely an intrusion but a presence with moods. It would slam the outer world in long, harsh breaths, then quiet for the length of a pot to boil. In those quieter moments the arched houses proved a sanctuary. Snow sifting from the caps made a thin patter that sounded like a distant rain. Amos sat with his back against the bench and his hat in his lap, and his fingers plucked a crooked chunk of wood as though testing its grain. He did not boast. He had learned to measure success by the warmth of a family and the sound of children breathing easy, but there were other, lesser battles, wolves that circled at the fringe, hungry and bold when the snow wiped out usual prey. On the 3rd night they came closer, their howls folding into the wind. A new howl, thin and hopeful, sent a shudder through the village. Silas built a ring of coals at the lean-to, where they had stacked rough hay to tempt a passing sound. The horses snorted and stamped, keeping their breath between them and the dark. Buck brayed once, a sound that felt to Silas like a bell. The people lit more lamps and set dogs to the gate to keep the wolves at a polite distance. A man with a musket would patrol, staying within sight of windows, not out of bravado, but necessity. Repairs continued in a kind of grim dance. A shoring post here, a sling of rawhide there. Where a rib cracked, they eased it and put a pair of braces along its lie. One night, in a thin, sick white hour, a rib in Oak Ridge's house gave with a terrible little pop. People moved and worked with the economy of long practice. Amos directed, and Hiram and Eli, back from Morgan's Fork with a sleigh of tarred rope and a small measure of flour, set a straight tree as a buttress and lashed it in. Rawhide would be soaked in warm water and wrapped. As it dried, it pulled tight like a living cord. They smoothed wet clay into seams, working fast so that the damp did not freeze to the touch of their hands. Where the men could not reach from inside, they cut small holes in the outer earth and crawled out to drag snow from the edge and hammer small wedges under the ledger. It is ugly work, cold hands scraping, breath sharp and white, but it is the honest work that keeps houses standing. Amos had a way of keeping a quiet voice near the men in those hours. He never spoke of doubt, only of measurements and of seeing where the wood had given. He knew the rib's teeth by feel and could tell when a notch had been too shallow or when the ledger was tired. He taught those with less experience to feel for a rib's sap direction, to listen to the wood's complaint like a patient who had mostly kept silence. It was not a matter of bluster. When the men had to use pitch for a seam, black, heavy, nasty-smelling, they did so in rationed amounts. Pitch solves small leaks, but invites future rot if used too liberally. Amos had them sparing with it. He would say, "Patch what you must. Make your lashings right so we need not paint over every wound." With each small repair, the settlement gathered more confidence. The arch's nature spread a load laterally and downward. When a rib bowed, the pressure did not concentrate like a blade. The earth cap, layered and tamped, worked as insulation. Yet they could not ignore the larger problem. A long stretch of storm could isolate the hollow entirely. Food would not ride in on snow. The horses could not haul heavy loads across drifts. There was a sense, growing and inescapable, that Hiram and Eli's return with supplies mattered more than any single shoring post or pitch patch. On the morning the riders rode back toward the hollow, the world had gone nearly blind. Snow drove in sheets that smelled faintly of sap and iron. Hiram's horse stumbled once and then found footing. Eli's mount followed uneasy, eyes rolling. The men had a single sled, hung with tarred cloth, and on it sat tins, a few sacks of grain, and a small barrel of molasses that smelled rich and almost indecent in its sweetness. They rode steady and cautious. The trading post at Morgan's Fork had given them what they could spare: a rope, a keg of hard soap, some candle tallow. Morgan himself had frowned at the expense and said nothing beyond making the account even, as if certain obligations should be quietly kept between neighbors. As the hollow receded into the rear of their vision, the wind grew fiercer. The pines leaned in some places, bowing their heads under howling. The riders took a narrow course, staying where the trees sheltered for a moment, a fraction of shelter. Hiram tightened his scarf and whispered into Eli's ear to hold the lead. They rode with a practical silence that was not loneliness, but the steady keeping of intent. Snow hit their faces and stung like curious needles. Twice their path vanished. They spent minutes in circles, feeling the horses' hooves and the soft drag of a sled runner, as if they were instruments in a room where the light had been turned out. Back in the hollow, Silas watched the doorway for a shape he could not predict. He felt as if the last few days had been an apprenticeship in attention. Every sound mattered. A distant creak, branches rubbing, a child's cough. The men who had gone out were all he could see in the distance of his mind. He turned the lamp and set a kettle on the bench, letting the steam fog his spectacles. The children muttered in sleep near the stones. Eliza moved quietly and measured out rations as if the act itself could make the world kinder. The weather, though, is a thing that doesn't ask how men arranged their lives. That afternoon a new mood fell over the hollow, like an animal settling in. The air moved in a particular way, as if the storm had taken a breath and decided to hold it. The snow came thicker now, and drifts formed fast, piling into the hollows of the yard and lapping at fence posts. The arch roofs bowed a hair under the load, where a man might have laughed at such a bend in ordinary times. Now it made him watch to see if the curve would snap or only bow. Amos called a council that evening in the shared house at the center of the cluster. It was not an assembly of pomp, but a meeting by lantern, brief and to the point. Silas sat with his elbows on his knees. Mercy and Abigail had lists. They counted what remained of each family's stores and assigned tasks. Some would stay and keep watch on the house's seams. Others would prepare for a longer ride if the men returned with the promised goods. The worst of it was not the storm itself, but the not knowing. If the supply sled failed to arrive, what would they ration? If the well remained sealed, how long could they melt snow for water? They agreed on shifts. Each house would maintain a set of eyes on the outer world, a rotation through the night. A team of 3 would secure the sagging edge of Oak Ridge's loess with extra supports, while another would check the children's houses for drafts. Amos and Silas, both steady and seasoned hands, would go to where the earth had settled lightest and reinforce the ledgers with stones hauled from the creek bed. Their breaths misted like ghosts as they loaded the stones on sleds. The work was timed around the storm's lesser ebbs, when the wind quieted enough to make a run worthwhile. They moved like a single organism, hands passing bundles, voices low and efficient. Eliza bent to lift a small sack and let out a soft sound that was not a complaint, but the fuel of endurance. The children were sent to bed with pockets of dried apples. They were told not to leave the houses and to mind the bench's temperature. Bran, the dog, circled and then settled by the hearth, his flank warm and heavy. At nightfall the first real test came. The wind pressed in a long full gust and drove a heap of snow to the threshold of Oak Ridge's repaired edge. The men on watch found their feet sinking and their arms tired. They braced the shoring post and fed the rawhide with hot water so it would stretch enough to take another twist. The bench hummed with a low, steady warmth underfoot, as if it, too, had a heart. Then the sound rose, a grinding, a moving weight. The simplest, most terrible noise of snow, finding a seam and deciding to get comfortable. Time seemed to condense into the small tasks they had planned: wedge, pull, hammer, cry. There was no heroism, only the doing of necessary things. Silas felt his muscles go taut as a rope. He worked with the men, sweating under layers, breath fogging like a white veil. He drove a wedge and then another. Amos's hands were steady as if the wood had memory of his touch. From the outside the snow beat like a drum against their patched roof. The wind roared. Men shouted short syllables across the space, and those few words cut through the storm as if they could slap sense into the world. It was then, in the middle of the night with the storm claiming the trees and the skybox as a single blank, that they heard the other sound. A distant bell or the faint echo of a hoof on a frozen road. A shout answered it, and someone called a name. The men dropped their tools and ran toward the lane. Hiram and Eli had returned, leaning into the storm on their horses, faces raw but alive, their sleds heavy with goods. For a moment there was jubilation so small and intimate it felt like laughter at a funeral. The men hauled the supplies into the lean-to and stacked them in the dim light while snow scoured the windows. But even that small relief came wrapped in new tension. The riders had been near lost once, Eli said, and they had seen the pines thrown down in a line at the hollow's far edge, as if something heavy had passed through the outer seam of woods. They had been held up one day, and their provisions were small rations. Morgan had closed neat. The sled's cargo was a godsend, and yet not enough. The settlement would need to be sparing. They could breathe. For the moment they had more than nothing. They returned to the houses and the checks. The night would be long. Snow sat in seams and gathers, finding edges in a way that mocked all measure. The arch roofs so far held. Each time a groan sounded from an upper rib, some men placed their hands to the curve and steadied it like a nurse holding a bone while a pot boiled. It is in those hours that you measure the truth of a design by the work you will do to keep it whole. Silas sat by the bench with his hands cupped around a tin of tea. His palms were raw from the cold and the work. The warmth of the stones seeped into his knees. Outside the wind made a sound like a low animal pacing. He thought of the men in clean shirts and careful notebooks who would, years from then, call the homes improbable. He thought of how they would write of load-bearing lines and of what they might miss in their neat graphs, the raw hide that shrunk and saved a beam, the pitched seam dragged by a neighbor in the darkest hour, the way a child's warmth on the bench makes a difference the mind can't compute. A house is more than timber and earth. It is the sum of hands and hours, and the dish done in the gray morning. The storm would not, in that night, decide everything. There were more days to come. Snow would continue, and the creek remained in its muffled sleep. But the arch had withstood the first assaults. It had given and been patched. It had provided a slow warmth and a place to gather supplies and to bury fear under blankets for a night. There was work yet, the shoring post to check, the spring's mouth to reopen, the wolves to keep at bay. And there was the matter of the supply balance, the rationing that had already begun. Silas rose from the bench and went to the door. He peered at the mound that was his house from outside, and ran a gloved hand along the earth cap. Snow brushed his sleeve and masked the roughness of tamped soil. The ribs underneath held like ribs hold breath. He touched the ledger stone where the rib sat and felt the small, reassuring chill of rock. He thought of Amos's quiet voice and the egg metaphor, and he smiled despite the weariness. There would be more to test. The storm had shown its teeth and had been met by men who did not flinch. They moved through the night with small acts of practicality. A wedge reset here, a guard posted there, a kettle fed under the bench. Children were comforted and their blankets warmed. Yet as the dark lengthened and the hours peeled like old bark, a different pressure made itself known. The snow, relentless and patient, had begun to pile in forms that made even the arch sweat. Drift began to shove against fences like waves, and small avalanches of powder slipped off a ridge and found seams in ways the men could not always predict. Silas slung a lantern, and with Amos and a team of 3 more, went to check the southern row where the wind had found a buffet to beat. They climbed through thawing drifts and widened paths. Each house got a look over, a cheek-wise pat to a rib, a shout to wake those who were dozing at the watch. They repaired where needed with the grammar they all knew: lash, brace, wedge, smear. They spoke in short phrases. There was no time for long speeches, only for the precise language of survival. As they worked, a sound rose from the deep like the bending of a great tree. Silas felt it in his teeth. It could be the creek moving under ice, or the wind finding a cavity and making the earth sing. He could not be certain. He could only be sure the people around him were steady, that their hands knew their tasks. That steadiness was, perhaps, as much the victory as the arched houses themselves. In the dim light, shaped by the bench's glow and by the lantern's halo, they labored as if each action might tip the balance between ruin and endurance. They returned to the Carter house exhausted, their shoulders raw and their clothes thick with hoarfrost. Inside, the bench gave off a last glow, the stones radiating the day's warmth as if remembering a sun that had never been. The children were awake now, rubbing their eyes, and Eliza had a small loaf tucked into her apron. They ate in silence that tasted like reprieve. Outside, the storm progressed, and the world lay under a common white knowing. There are moments in such nights when a man can feel the geometry of his life as plainly as the curve of a roof. Silas thought of the ribs under his hand, of the ledger stones, of the rawhide tightening like a promise. He thought of the men who would later doubt the wisdom of those buried roofs, and of how, in the cold and the dark, work and shape made their own kind of proof. For now the proof was in the warm stone, in the children's breathing, in the horses' steady snorts, and in the steady return of 2 men with a sled. The storm was not finished. The hours ahead would demand other responses, and the spring's mouth would need digging anew at the first thaw. But as they extinguished lamps and drew blankets close, Silas looked at the arch's silhouette and felt how a house could be both a thing and an act, built not merely to stand, but to be kept by hands that would not be idle. He felt, too, how the settlement's fate would be decided not by a single invention, but by the long, patient labor that accompanies any sensible design. Outside, the wind hunched and paced, as if thinking of a greater test. The night pressed in. They slept lightly. Dawn came in a different color the next morning, paler, threaded with the hint of thaw. Where the storm had press-ganged the world into uniform white, there were now edges that softened. The sharp lip of a drift slumped into a rounded shoulder, a branch shed a crust and let water bead down like a small confession. Men unbolted doors and breathed steam into the air, as if to see whether the day would keep its promise. The bench in Silas's house still held last night's heat. Hands warmed there first, then faces, then conversations. They went at the spring with a steadier hope. The hole at the creek mouth was a frozen mouth, but not impossibly so. Shovels clipped ice and threw it back in chunks. Men worked in shifts to avoid numbing hands. One would heave while another kept the fire stoked to make buckets warm before the water hit them. When a thaw begins in earnest, it is measured not only in melting, but in how quickly mud takes back its promises. You must dig while the ground will bear the burden of motion. Stones were hauled and wedged upriver to guide the melt and to stop the ice from reclaiming the channel. By midday a small fall ran again, uncertain and winding. But it ran, and fingers dipped to it and came away wet. Hiram and Eli told their tale in clipped, tired syllables over a shared stew.
"White fell in clots," Eli said, voice like sand, "and once the trees lay down, we lost the sight of the road. I thought we might be taking a new course out of the world." Hiram's hands shook as he handed a cup to a child. He had a bruise on his cheek where steering a horse had turned sudden. They had nearly taken a drift that hit a creek and found themselves in a shallow pool up to the saddle. The horses had pulled, and that pull had been the hinge between getting home and becoming part of the snow. The men shrugged off gratitude like cold coats. They said only, "Thank Morgan," and the settlement felt little needles of relief. Repairs became not a one-night scramble, but a week's careful tending. Amos inspected each arch in turn with a craftsman's patience, testing not with diagrams but with touch and subtle leverage. He put a ladle of warm pitch in a pan and used it only where a seam inhaled cold, in a way that suggested water might later make a wound. He tightened rawhide lashings where they had slackened and replaced any green rib that had been pinned, last in haste. They took apart the most distressed crown and eased in a fresh rib, bent not by the steam of a workshop but by patient heat from a near fire and the slow pressure of men's shoulders. When Amos explained once more how the arch worked, he used the same plain image with a new turn. Press the side of an egg and the force runs around it. Press the arch in the middle and the ribs carry that push to the ledger at their feet. It is a borrowing of nature, simple and stubborn. They checked the bench's flue carefully, for if that stone spine failed, the settlement's best reserve of warmth would dim. The smoke channel had held up. Soot collected in small ridges, the stones warmed to the touch as the flue had siphoned heat into them and left the chimney with air that was forgiving rather than scorching. Silas demonstrated again to a skeptical neighbor how the smoke ran. The hearth's breath was led beneath the stones and released afterward, so the bench drank heat before the air left the house. The effect was not mystical, it was patient physics handed down by people who watched and adjusted. The bench's stones were a cache, heat stored by the day and lent back at night, no different in its way from a field that holds sun until the seed needs it. The wolves, discouraged by the human watch and by the smell of iron and cord, kept moving away from the hollow. A pack circled once more at dusk and then drifted to the farther ridge where prey still moved. Bran the dog went on long patrols and returned without tear or blood. The settlement fortified their livestock by moving the mares into tighter pens and by piling brush between fence rails to break the wind. Nothing grand happened, no sudden chase or triumph, only the steady doing of what was required to keep the animals breathing and feed on the shelves. Spring did not arrive in a day, but in measures. A gullible sun on an afternoon that felt unseasonably kind, a thawing gutter, the softening of a chain. The men patched the worst of Oak Ridge's outer edge with an extra belt of earth and a new ledger that sat a hair deeper. They smoothed and rounded the cap so water would not stand in a bowl and rot the ribs beneath. Where clay had been tamped in hurried hands and left lumpy, Amos and his crew relayered with the careful rhythm of the original building. Thingras mats, layer upon layer of reed, then soil pressed as if closing a hand. It was laborious, but meant to last through seasons when hands would be less able. Community rhythms reknit themselves. Jars were reshelved. Rations were counted again, this time with less panic and more precise economy. The children, their world opened again by thaw, made small sleds from broken boards and towed them beneath the pines, while older boys practiced stacking wood so that the next storm would find supplies neat and reachable. Eliza made a larger loaf one morning to mark a small grace, and the house smelled of yeast for an hour that felt like a benediction. News, of course, travels in soft and crooked ways. Travelers sometimes stop to rest their feet on benches and to ask where the road leads, and on one such afternoon, a man from a further village who had seen timber forms and earth mounds told a thin story of men in town who kept asking whether such roofs could face a true winter. He did not mean malice. He meant to measure a new thing against the old ledger of skepticism. Amos listened and only smiled. "We do not give guarantees," he said once as they stood on a knoll and watched smoke threads rise straight in a season's calm. "I will tell you what we can do. We build to carry weight sideways and down. We give ourselves a bench that keeps the coal longer. We put our hands to the work when weather forgets its manners." Still, the winter's test had left them with a different kind of proof, an evidence gathered not in numbers but in the persistence of life. The settlement had not been spared work.
It had been spared the worst ruin because of both shape and hand. In the weeks after the storm, people from neighboring clearings came through, curious and practical. Silas showed them the ribs, poking at a notch and explaining, short and blunt, how a beam shoulder should rest and how a ledger must be dry. He spoke without pride and without apology. It took our sweat and a good deal of sense. It took our being willing to fix what we broke through the season. The arch helps, but it will not fix neglect. There were quiet reckonings as well. Men who had doubted Amos in market apologized in small ways, sending a sack of flour, staying to lend an extra hand when the next rib was bent. It was not a formal admission. The frontier is not given to loud recantations. Instead, the work itself became the argument. There were new benches that seemed to hold their warmth deeper into the nights. There were more houses with rounded caps where birds nested in summer. The houses did not solve every danger. Ponds would still freeze, roads would still be treacherous in future storms. But the people of Pine Hollow had learned that design that respects material and season can bend the odds. Years later, decades when younger hands had grown old and the bench stones had learned more patterns of soot, strangers in tidy shirts and with ruled notebooks would write about such houses and call them unlikely. They would ask for calculations for a test done under the strict rules of towns that seldom had to face a wild winter. They would smile at the idea of an earthen cap and a low ceiling and wonder if a single storm could be proof enough. Those men were a different kind of witness, patient with numbers, quick with hypotheticals, but there is another kind of witness that cannot be boxed into margins of a page. The children warmed through a family's rationed nights, the mare that kept its strength to pull a sled in March, the ledger stone still cold beneath a stranger's hand. If anyone asks how the proof was given, Silas would point not to a sheet of paper, but to the ledger by the door, and to the bench where children sat, and to the fact that come the long white year after the storm, they had not been swept away. He would say that the arch did not make them invulnerable, but that it, along with the readiness to bind rawhide and tamped clay and haul stones in a storm, let them bend in ways that a flat plane could not. The test in the end was lived rather than measured. The roof had bent and been mended. The bench had kept a slow heart of warmth. Hands had stayed ready. On a spring morning, months after the great storm, the village gathered at the edge of the pines. Snow still clung to shadows, but rivers ran clear. Children, cheeks flushed, rolled small balls and stacked them into imperfect towers that melted as they cried for attention. Their laughter was a small proof. Amos stood apart for a moment, hat in hand, watching the roofs gleam with a new light where the earth cap had shed the last of winter's crust. Silas sat on his bench, hands idly feeling the faded grooves of a spoon he had whittled in a quiet watch. He looked at the settlement, at the lean-to where Hiram kept his tools, at the barn where Buck nosed for a treat, and felt a tired kind of satisfaction. Decades later, strangers would still come and ask about the arched houses with a doubt that was polite and neat. They would not stand.